Good morning, viewers. This is Sage live from the 𝐊𝐴𝐼𝐼 studio. You're watching The Early Trades, a show where we share with you a glimpse of the Australian share market opening trade scenario, along with the global and domestic drivers triggering the market's momentum. And in our first segment of the show today, we'll look at how the early morning trades panned out, taking cues from Wall Street's action on Friday. And next, we'll zoom our lens on the sector movements on the Australian Stock Exchange. And then in the last segment, we will look at prominent newsmakers grabbing the headlines during the early trading hours. So plenty to look forward to, and the Australian share market opened higher at the beginning of a new month and on the first day of the week, despite Wall Street's closing lower in Friday's session. And on Wall Street, the Dow Jones declined 0.4%, the Nasdaq fell 0.7%, and the S&P 500 dipped 0.5%. The US stock markets declined sharply due to a weak outlook by Amazon, which knocked its stock 7.6% lower, and investors took cues from the risks posed by the Delta COVID mutant. And looking at the inflation scenario, US consumer spending climbed higher than expected. The annual inflation surged further above the 2% target set by the Federal Reserve. And moving on ahead, other than the latest batch of earnings, US investors would keep a tab on the monthly jobs report. And at the same time, traders will watch for the manufacturing and service sector activity, factory orders, and the US trade deficit data this week. Let's take a look at the bond market. The bond yields declined after a key inflation reading matched expectations. The yield on the benchmark 10-year note fell by 3 basis points. And the US dollar index stayed on the defensive side. However, the dollar has strengthened over the last few weeks on concerns over the Delta coronavirus variant and the worries about China's economy. On that note, let us now skim through the opening trades of the ASX 200, and the information technology has been the star performer today, given the upbeat BNPL sector momentum. The top performing stock in the index was buy now, pay later giant Afterpay on Square's acquisition. 𝐊𝐴𝐼𝐼 also traded higher, with BNPL sector under the spotlight, and the resource players Pilbara Minerals, Oil Search and Ramelius Resources also advanced. And meanwhile, global testing, inspection and certification company ALS, leading imaging IT provider Pro Medicus, and iron ore miner Champion Iron, and industrial player Boral were the leading losers on the board. Let's take a look at the next segment and glancing through the ASX sectoral charter in detail. Well, as mentioned previously, IT has been the shining sector today. Post Afterpay's update, WAAX Components, WiseTech, Global, Afterpay, Appen, Altium and Xero traded higher, defying the cues from weak Nasdaq session on Friday. Then the Australian energy players Beach Energy, Santos, Origin Energy, Woodside Petroleum and Oil Search traded in the green zone during the early trading hours amid the oil price uptick on expectations of demand growing faster than the supply. And September's Brent crude futures, which expired on Friday, surged 0.4%. The US West Texas Intermediate crude futures rose 0.5%. And now let's move on to the miners space. The heavyweight miners BHP Group, Rio Tinto and Fortescue Metals traded lower as the iron ore prices fell, weighed by prospects of a slowdown in demand from China. And the output cuts by the Chinese steel firms resulted in iron ore prices sinking lower. The most traded iron ore for September delivery on China's Dalian Commodity Exchange closed 7.5% lower. And however, in the yellow metal space, Newcrest Mining, Evolution Mining, Ramelius and Gold Road edged higher, despite the gold price downtick on Friday after firmer US dollar ended last week's Federal Reserve inspired rally, and the spot gold price fell 1%. So the healthcare, utilities and financial sectors all pulled the strings of the ASX 200 up. And now it's time for a short break, but please stay tuned as I'll be back with more of the updates on the Australian share market. Crypto talk by 𝐊𝐼𝐼. The crypto market has been red hot given the Bitcoin rally since the past year. And now the most famous cryptocurrency has got competitors, Dogecoin and Ethereum. If the crypto market excites you, tune in with me, Sage, to know the latest developments about the existing digital currencies and the new ones that are joining the race. I'll help you understand the opportunities and the risks the crypto market has in store for you. For all the digital currency related developments, Continue watching Crypto Talk by 𝐊𝐴𝐚𝐥𝐤𝐢𝐧𝐞. Welcome back, viewers. Thank you so much for joining us. This is your host, Sage, live from the 𝐊𝐴𝐚𝐥𝐤𝐢𝐧𝐞 studios, and you're watching the early trades, where we share with you a glimpse of the Australian share market's opening trade scenario. So let's move on now to the last segment of the show, where we take the highlights of the prominent ASX stocks under the spotlight during the early trades. And the biggest news this morning is coming in from BNPL juggernaut Afterpay, who soared during the early trades post receiving takeover offer from Square. So Square has agreed to acquire all of the issued shares in Afterpay, and the transaction has an implied value of approximately $29 billion based on the closing price of Square common stock on July 30th, 2021, and is expected to be paid in all stock. The acquisition aims to enable the companies to better deliver compelling financial products and services that expand access to more consumers and drive incremental revenue for merchants of all sizes. The closing of the transaction is expected in the first quarter of the calendar year 2022, subject to the satisfaction of certain closing conditions outlined below. So, in the annual report, Afterpay reported a 102% increase in the underlying sales on a constant current basis in the financial year 2021, primarily driven by a massive 242% increase in the sales of ClearPay. So besides, the total revenue for the group rose 88% to 925 million Australian dollars. Interesting news from Afterpay. And next up we have oil and gas explorer Oil Search, who soared on agreeing to a merger with Santos. And as per the latest update, the deal would give Oil Search a total of 38.5% stake in the combined entity, which would be equal to a premium of approximately 20% on the company's share closing price in the middle of July 2021. Also in the news is the gold producer Ramelius Resources, who advanced on divesting its interest in Kathleen Valley's lithium royalty to Liontown Resources for a total of 30.25 million Australian dollars. The management would be using the proceeds to fund the company's growth. And Cedar Woods Properties also made the news, rising on acquiring 2 properties in Melbourne's Western Growth Corridor for a total of 63.5 million Australian dollars, in the site in Fieldstone, which was bought for 33 million Australian dollars, and a 14.6 hectare Fraser Rise site was also purchased for 30.5 million Australian dollars. And then the Mineral Resources traded in the red zone on entering into an agreement to purchase a 40% stake in Red Hill Iron's Red Hill Iron Ore joint venture for a total consideration of 400 million Australian dollars. And according to the company, the first instalment of 200 would be paid upon the completion of sale, and the remaining amount after the first commercial shipment of iron ore departs from the port. And that's all on the major market movers for this morning. Thanks again for your time joining us and looking at the specific market drivers for the Australian share market. The data on the CoreLogic dwelling prices for July will be released on Monday. Then the domestic investors would closely track the Reserve Bank on Australia's monetary policy meeting on Tuesday, and Australia's central bank may withdraw its decision to taper the bond buying program if Sydney remains in a coronavirus lockdown, according to The Economists. The central bank had earlier said in June that it would reduce its debt purchases from September due to better than expected economic outcomes. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics is also releasing data on lending indicators and building approvals on Wednesday, and the retail trade for June on Thursday, and international trade and payroll, jobs and wages data on Friday. And of course, reporting season will be closely evaluated this week as well to gauge the winners and losers, so plenty to look forward to. But that's all for now in the early morning trades, so stay tuned with 𝐊𝐴𝐚 TV as we'll have more of the shows lined up for you, sharing the live updates across the economy, markets and sectors. This is Sage signing off for now.